La lutte contre les violences sexuelles liées au conflit sous l'angle du droit international, des obligations juridiques de lutte. L'idée sous-jacente est d'envisager les violences sexuelles liées au conflit sous différentes approches, au travers de régimes juridiques majeurs, principaux, de droit international contemporain, le droit international humanitaire, bien sûr, le droit international des droits humains également, le trafic d'êtres humains, ou encore la lutte contre le terrorisme. Nous avons le plaisir, pour traiter ces 4 dimensions choisies, de réunir 4 experts que je vais très rapidement présenter. Tout d'abord, Paola Forgione, qui est conseillère juridique au Comité international de la Croix-Rouge et qui présentera une communication intitulée « International Humanitarian Law and Sexual Violence, the ICRC's Work on Addressing Sexual Violence through National Implementation ». Donc déjà, au travers du cadre juridique international, c'est la mise en œuvre qui sera questionnée dès cette première table ronde. Anne-Marie de Brouwer, qui est la directrice de IMPACT, le Center Against Human Trafficking and Sexual Violence in Conflict, qui présentera une communication intitulée « The Fight Against TRSV Linked to Trafficking in Persons ». Lorraine Dumont, qui travaille à la Max Planck Foundation for International Peace and the Rule of Law, qui présentera une communication intitulée « Armed Conflict and Sexual Violence in International Human Rights Law in the Light of Feminist Legal Theory ». Et enfin, Gioia Elias, dont j'ai déjà parlé tout à l'heure dans le cadre de l'allocution d'ouverture. Gioia est Programme Manager au International Institute for Peace and the Rule of Law, et elle présentera une communication intitulée « Investigating and Prosecuting Sexual Violence Linked to Terrorism ». Chers panélistes, donc chaque présentation va durer une quinzaine de minutes, 15 minutes. Mon rôle va être de veiller au temps, de manière à garder une plage horaire significative, conséquente, qui nous permettra d'échanger entre les intervenantes ici réunies, mais aussi avec l'auditoire. Nous y tenons beaucoup. Je vais donc sans plus tarder donner la parole à Madame Forgione pour la présentation du droit international humanitaire et du rôle du CICR dans la lutte.
Good morning. It's an honor to be the first panelist. Thank you very much for this introduction. So I will present first of all the IHL, International Humanitarian Law, legal framework surrounding sexual violence. I will then address the challenges on the ground, so what's not working, and do a very quick reality check. I will then focus on the national implementation of this international framework. How can a state translate the international legal framework on sexual violence into its domestic legislation? And finally, I will present some opportunities and challenges and discuss the way forward for the national implementation. Talking first about the IHL legal framework, I have indicated some milestones for international humanitarian law that most of you are probably already very familiar with. When it comes to sexual violence, each of these milestones has brought something to the contemporary understanding of sexual violence. In particular, there have been 2 very important evolutions from the Geneva Convention to the customary IHL, International Humanitarian Law, definition of sexual violence that we have nowadays. First of all, the Geneva Conventions don't talk about sexual violence. They only talk about rape, specifically rape. So it's actually the jurisprudence of the international tribunals that told us, well, actually also other acts of sexual nature constitute a war crime, even if it's not rape. For example, forced stripping, forced public nudity, sexual slavery, mutilation of sexual parts. So it is only thanks to this case law that the crime of sexual violence is now understood more broadly. So it's not only rape, it's other sexual acts as well. The second important evolution has to do with the victims. The Geneva Conventions were talking about rape against women. It is only with the additional protocols that it is established that rape can be committed against any person. So you don't need to be a woman to be raped. This I just summarized. It's a bit more complicated and long, but in 15 minutes I had some time constraints. Anyway, today, and we come to the contemporary IHL definition that is generally accepted of what is sexual violence. The term is used to describe any act of sexual nature committed against any person under circumstances which are coercive. Coercive circumstances include force, threat of force, but also fear of violence, psychological oppression, abuse of power. These acts are prohibited in armed conflicts of international and non-international character. So in all armed conflicts, these acts are prohibited. Does it mean that in peacetime they are fine? Of course, not at all. Indeed, it's important to remind that when IHL is not applicable, because sexual violence is not connected to a conflict, we have a framework of domestic law and international human rights law. And we have bear this in mind in our checklist that I will present in a minute. Before I wanted to move to the second problem, so I presented you the legal framework on sexual violence, which actually nowadays looks quite comprehensive. So what's not working? I hope you can see the slide. So the first problem, I just gathered some of the issue. It's not a comprehensive list, of course. The problem that is often found is a lack of accountability, a climate of impunity. Of course, there is a climate of impunity when sexual violence is used as a policy, I would say, is used as a method of war. So in those circumstances, we often find impunity, but sometimes impunity happens just because the legal system is very weak. So even if there is not an intention to, or a policy or a strategy to commit widespread sexual violence, the system, the legal system, the judicial system might be done in a way that doesn't really prevent and punish violations, this type of violations. Another issue is the lack of support, a support system for victims. Support system, that means psychological support, but also access to healthcare. I quoted here the survivor-centered approach that the special representative also mentioned in the keynote speech. And that should guide states' responses to sexual violence. And a part of a survivor-centered approach is to create a support system for the victims. There are also misconceptions. For example, that only women can be victims of sexual violence. A misconception that was also originally in the Geneva Conventions of 1949. There are then living conditions related to conflict, life of internally displaced people can, for example, can be so complicated, so complex, can create a fertile ground for abuse of power, for example, and so sexual violence. And then an important point is also the availability of weapons. Indeed, the Arms Trade Treaty contains a specific provision obliging states to do a sort of due diligence before selling weapons to other states, and in particular prevents states from selling weapons to other states if in these states there is an overriding risk that war crimes, crimes against humanity, including serious violation of gender-based violence, serious acts, of gender-based violence can be committed. These factors are not exclusive to a conflict, but might be exacerbated in a situation of conflict. Some of them, we have noticed that some of them can be reduced with a good domestic framework. And I will give you a couple of examples. When we talk about lack of accountability, for accountability to exist, victims should report. I wouldn't report if I were a victim of sexual violence if I knew I would face charges of, for example, adultery. So this is a legal barrier for reporting, and so is a legal barrier to punish those responsible. Another example is if I were a man victim of sexual violence, but the law only says that only women can be victims of sexual violence, I also wouldn't report because the crime I lived simply doesn't exist in the system. I'm invisible. Another example on the survivor-centered approach. If I am an undocumented migrant, if I'm a refugee, if the healthcare system is not available to me, or if I'm an illegal migrant, so I'm afraid to be deported, I also wouldn't probably seek medical care. So, of course, you can have a situation where the legal framework is absolutely perfect and still there are violations, but in our experience, often we face legal frameworks that are far from perfect and that have many gaps. This is why we developed this checklist. The checklist has the objective to verify that a domestic legal system comply with international standards. The checklist is not only focused on the international humanitarian law, but we have decided to also include the international human rights law, because we didn't want to create a hierarchy among victims and tell victim, oh, have you been victim of a violation in connection to the conflict or not? Because if the violation wasn't in connection to the conflict, it's not really our business. So we didn't want to create this hierarchy, so the checklist, we try to be extremely comprehensive. with it. What's the target? The target is state lawyers. So anybody, in fact, who want to check that a state legislation complies with the international standards. It is divided in 8 thematics, 8 different topics. For example, definitions, accessibility to healthcare and justice, special measures for some groups that might be particularly vulnerable to sexual violence, as internally displaced people or people with disabilities, penalties, and remedies and reparations. These are just some of the topics of the checklist. And in total, the checklist has 28 questions that any lawyer interested in seeing whether the domestic legislation of a certain country complies with IHL should try to answer. We developed this checklist together with the national societies of the Red Cross from all countries in the world. We tried to gather as much feedback as possible, and we also did a research on state practice, because we also wanted to include good practices to show that it's actually possible. So for every question, you would find an example of a state, or more than one, of a state practice that actually complies with international standards. Very quickly, I would like to address a couple of points that are in the checklist. The first one is the definition. Yes, very quickly. I will try here to simplify with very accessible images. So very important, anyone can commit sexual violence, anyone can be victim of sexual violence, any gender, but also a combatant or a civilian. They can both be victims and perpetrators of sexual violence. You might be surprised about the number of countries that do not have gender-neutral language in their sexual violence legislation. Maybe I will skip this one, and I will move to another aspect of the checklist, which is reporting. Some states have included mandatory reporting in their legislation because they want to have figures and they want to obtain accountability. But sometimes we have found that mandatory reporting can be counterproductive because victims fear retaliation, victims fear that their identity might be exposed. So we suggest to put the survivors' desire at the center and ensure, for example, that if there is a mandatory reporting, it is anonymized. Or that at the very least, the mandatory reporting is not a precondition to access healthcare, because in our experience, when this happens, people simply don't seek medical care because they are afraid of the consequences of reporting. Very last point, what's next? So the checklist is useful to identify gaps, but then, of course, it's just a diagnosis of a country's legislation. The process is then quite long. Legislation needs to be amended. New legislation needs to be disseminated to those who will apply the legislation, so judges, but also to healthcare staff. And so this is part of the complex implementation of the legal framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Forgione for this very first presentation. It was a very stimulating one with a deep vision, but also very concrete and precise examples of the obstacles that we meet on the ground, technically obstacles to the implementation of the rules. Sorry for the frustration about the time, but we will also take advantage of the discussion to come back on some points that were not presented so deeply. Let's turn to the next presentation by Anne-Marie de Brouwer, Director of IMPACT, the Center Against Human Trafficking and Sexual Violence in Conflict. Your presentation is about the fight against CRSV linked to trafficking in persons. Yes. You have the floor.
Okay. Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation to be here. Yes, I would like to say a few words about the linkages between CRSV and human trafficking, specifically with regard to human trafficking as sexual exploitation. Well, as you know, since 2016, the United Nations actually recognized the nexus between CRSV and trafficking in persons for sexual exploitation, TIP-S. I will abbreviate it as TIP-S. However, both of these crimes, CRSV as international crimes and TIP-S as transnational crimes, have developed in silo, resulting in different elements of the crimes and also different frameworks to address them. So there's currently some misunderstanding also, both at the national and international level, of how these crimes actually, in fact, can be addressed and how they are connected and how accountability can also result from that. I think the war in Ukraine has actually also made it clear that at the moment there is more momentum also to actually look at these linkages. It has been recognized by the government of Ukraine and others that there is a nexus between those crimes. So in this presentation, I would like to say a few words about that nexus and how we can try to come to a better understanding of these crimes and accountability. So as mentioned, both crimes have actually developed in silo. We have already heard a little bit the history of how conflict-related sexual violence has developed, and we all know how this has been developed since the Nuremberg up till now, and also how the definition of CRSV has been set by the UN, but also through the statutes and case law of tribunals and courts, in particular also the ICC since 1998, and this has, of course, resulted in many different conflict-related sexual violence, including rape, sexual slavery, and forced prostitution, as long as the situation is there that it's a genocide or crimes against humanity or war crimes. On the other hand, the definition of TIP can be found in the 2000 UN Protocol of Palermo, ratified by 181 states, and it almost has universal recognition in that case. In order to speak about TIP, there needs to be an act, so it can be transportation, there needs to be a means, for example, coercion or deception, and there needs, the third requirement is that there is a purpose of exploitation. For example, a specific intent for sexual exploitation or forced labor. So in short, TIP is really about trading in people with the intent to exploit them for, in most cases, profit-making. And in fact, it's one of the most, most profitable crimes in the world because people are really used as commodities and a lot of money is made out of it. So TIP is a transnational crime because it may involve the crossing of international borders, but it can also take place within one country and is usually prosecuted on the national level. And therefore, each country has its own legislation and also its own definition on TIP, but based on the Palermo Protocol. So when in 2016, prompted by the alarming use of trafficking and trade of women and girls for sexual exploitation, as part of the modus operandi also of several non-state armed groups, including terrorist groups, Ms. Pramila Patten already highlighted this morning, such as Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab, the nexus between trafficking in persons and sexual violence in conflict was recognized. It underlined not only that nexus, but also the nexus with terrorism and organized crime. And it did so again in 2017. in a resolution. So following that adoption of that Security Council resolution 2331 of 2016, the UN Secretary General annual reports on sexual violence in conflict would include trafficking in persons when committed in situations of conflict for the purpose of sexual violence/exploitation as a form of conflict-related sexual violence. And subsequent annual reports also included similar language. And evidence of such crimes was found in diverse contexts such as Iraq, Mali, Colombia, Libya, and Myanmar. So the nexus was established at that point. But the nexus was also established already a little bit earlier in 1998 when the Rome Statute of the ICC was drafted. Because if you look at the statute and the elements of crimes of the ICC, you will find the crimes of slavery and sexual slavery as a war crime and a crime against humanity, and the crime of enslavement as a crime against humanity, which both refer actually to human trafficking as indicia, well, indications that the elements of the crimes of enslavement and sexual slavery are proven. You can find that in particular when you are looking at the footnotes of the elements of crimes documents. So in other words, evidence of human trafficking can actually help to establish that sexual slavery or enslavement occurred, and that there was thus a power of ownership over a person. So the ICC does not really recognize human trafficking, including for sexual exploitation, as a self-standing crime under international criminal law. But as mentioned, such evidence can be used actually to prove and support the prosecution for crimes such as sexual slavery or enslavement. So both of these crimes, CRSV crimes and TIP-S, in conflict have several similarities in common, but also several differences. So for example, in terms of similarities, both crimes cover a sexual component. And in addition, while for TIP-S, there's almost always a financial gain for the perpetrator involved, several CRSV crimes also require such a financial gain, such as sexual slavery or enslavement even, or forced prostitution. It could be. So for example, where women are kept in slavery or sexual slavery or even enforced prostitution, and money is made out of the situation, you could qualify the situation as both CRSV crimes or and TIP-S linked to armed conflict. But there are also differences. For example, CRSV crimes are different from TIP-S because for CRSV crimes, the lack of consent is not an element of the crime. It's basically recognized that this is not an element and that it basically cannot be raised as a defense, only in very limited circumstances. For TIP-S, lack of consent can, however, more easily be raised and is in practice also often done in national jurisdictions by the defense, which in the end actually only victimizes the victims by re-traumatizing them, asking about issues of consent. So there are several possibilities, I think, when it comes to the prosecution of CRSV, TIP-S, and its nexus. So first of all, CRSV can be prosecuted as an international crime before international criminal tribunals and courts, but also before national jurisdictions in case they have good international crimes legislation in place. So preferably based on the ICC Rome Statute. And if there is evidence of human trafficking, this evidence can be used to prove the elements of the crimes of sexual slavery or enslavement, for instance. And in this way, if a conviction is then sustained, you have a clear linkages between also those crimes, human trafficking and conflict-related sexual violence. It's very much present. I'm not so much in favor of having actually a separate crime of human trafficking as an international crime, even though this was recently also suggested by the Special Rapporteur on Human Trafficking, because I think the international crimes legislation is already in place, and which is also the case for human trafficking crimes. And both regimes are actually complementary and mutually reinforcing each other. So And at the same time, soon the Rome Statute will probably be amended by including the slave trade also as an international crime. And it has a lot of similarities with the crime of human trafficking. So second, I think both CRSV and TIP-S can be separately prosecuted under national legislation where available. So for example, in the Netherlands, there's currently a case going on against a Syrian man accused of several CRSV crimes, rape as a crime against humanity, for crimes committed in Syria in 2013-2014. And in Germany, you see universal jurisdiction cases where also CRSV is being prosecuted, and also including rape as a crime against humanity, but also enslavement, but also, for instance, terrorism charges and human trafficking. In that case, human trafficking for labor exploitation most of the time. Oh, 2 minutes, yes. So third, I think we can also look at prosecuting these crimes under slavery provisions in criminal codes, for instance, when they are available. Most of the times these are not used, but they are there. And fourth, we can look at terrorism legislation. And we have seen already some good practices. This morning also the case of Nigeria was mentioned. But there's also some states which actually include sexual and gender-based crimes as tools to commit terrorism, such as Tunisia, Gambia, and Kosovo. So, and I think my colleague will say a bit more about that. And then finally, we have the peacetime provisions on rape. So, very quickly, is that possible? Yes? It is. Yeah. So some recommendations. We are currently also looking into a research for also Pramila Patton's office on the nexus between these crimes. And we did some literature review, and also we set out some perception surveys among stakeholders dealing with CRSV and TIP-S to see whether they recognize and think if the nexus between those crimes are really important. So one of the things that came out of it is that people most of the times really work in silos, either on CRSV or on human trafficking, or on terrorism, or on international criminal law generally, or SGBV crimes generally. So it's important actually to also see how we can actually work better together and to educate ourselves on how we can better work together and understand these crimes and how they are related. Then second of all, I think also the review of some 20 countries also showed that really, and it has been mentioned more often, that the legislation is really not up to date. The law is very often not equipped to deal with a CRSV or even with human trafficking. That human trafficking cases for sexual exploitation are higher than for CRSV, but even in those cases, the number is minimal and the convictions is even less. So a recommendation would, of course, be to update these laws and also to see how you can make use of cumulative charging of both of these crimes. And then thirdly, I think we can also learn from both systems. Like the human trafficking system is sometimes better in national jurisdictions in terms of providing protection and support for victims. And that's not always or very often not the case for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. So we can learn from each other and improve that situation. And also to look at the issue of lack of consent again, because I think for CRSV as an international crime, we are more advanced in our thinking about acknowledging that we should not raise that as an issue. And that's not always the case for trafficking for sexual exploitation cases. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mrs. De Brouwer, for this very interesting presentation, a very clear presentation of a complex technical question of international law, the connection, the links, the interrelations between distinct legal regimes. That was very clear, and I have no doubt that many questions could rise from your oral presentation this morning. Nous allons passer à la troisième présentation qui va être assurée par Madame Lorraine Dumont, Max Planck Foundation for International Peace and the Rule of Law. Votre présentation, que j'annonce en français, mais elle sera peut-être en anglais.
En français.
En français.
En français.
Parfait. Je vais quand même lire le titre en anglais tel que nous l'avons défini. Votre présentation porte sur le sujet Armed Conflict and Sexual Violence in International Human Rights Law in Light of the Feminist Legal Theory. You have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, professeur. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci aux organisateurs, merci aux participants de ce colloque. Donc, mon intervention porte sur les violences sexuelles et conflits armés en droit international des droits humains, à la lumière de la critique féministe du droit. Et pour respecter le temps qui m'est imparti, je vais aller extrêmement vite et je présente toutes mes excuses à Madame la traductrice. Et quant à vous, mesdames et messieurs les auditeurs, vous remarquerez que sur toutes mes slides, j'ai mis mon adresse email et que si vous êtes intéressés par des affaires que je mentionne ou par un sujet, vous pourrez m'envoyer un mail et je vous transmettrai mon PowerPoint parce que vous n'allez certainement pas avoir le temps de le lire en entier. Ceci étant dit, il y aura normalement aussi une contribution à ce colloque et des questions également pour revenir sur les sujets que je n'aurais pas approfondis et qui vous intéressent. Donc je vous invite à revenir vers moi s'il y a des points que vous souhaitez approfondir. En guise d'introduction, je vais définir les termes de mon sujet en commençant très rapidement avec la critique féministe du droit. Qu'est-ce que la critique féministe du droit? Il s'agit de tirer des conséquences de l'évincement historique des femmes vis-à-vis des sphères du savoir et du pouvoir. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? Ça veut dire qu'en raison de leur sexe, les femmes ont peu participé à la création et au développement des règles. Conséquence, le droit peut se trouver inadapté à la réalité de la vie des femmes. Et ça, si vous cherchez le lien dans mon intervention entre les droits humains et la critique féministe, c'est ça, c'est qu'on va chercher si le droit international des droits humains est adapté à la réalité de la vie des femmes. L'une des principales découvertes de la critique féministe du droit, ça va être celle de l'impact de la distinction entre la sphère publique et la sphère privée sur les droits des femmes. Nous pourrons y revenir en question, j'ai plusieurs exemples à ce sujet, mais le plus connu, c'est celui de la Convention contre la torture, qui définit une telle pratique en disant qu'elle est commise par un officier public ou une personne agissant en sa qualité officielle. Or, vous n'êtes pas sans savoir que la plupart des violences subies par les femmes ont lieu dans la sphère privée, voire même au sein du foyer. Ça veut dire qu'un viol perpétré par un membre de la famille, par exemple, ne peut pas être qualifié d'acte de torture à l'aune de cette convention. Qu'est-ce que les violences sexuelles maintenant? Les violences sexuelles vont bien au-delà du viol, elles peuvent concerner les hommes et les femmes. Il y a notamment une liste de certaines violences sexuelles dans le statut de Rome, mais la Cour interaméricaine des droits de l'homme l'a aussi définie dans l'affaire Miguel Castro prison contre Pérou, qui concerne l'attaque d'une prison par l'armée péruvienne au motif que cette prison aurait été contrôlée par un groupe terroriste communiste. Et dans cette affaire, une centaine de victimes étaient des femmes. La Cour interaméricaine a décrit la violence sexuelle comme étant notamment, outre l'invasion physique du corps humain, des actes qui n'impliquent pas de pénétration, ni même de contact physique, quel qu'il soit. Par exemple, dans cette affaire, des femmes prisonnières avaient été forcées de rester nues dans un hôpital sous la surveillance d'hommes armés, ce que la Cour interaméricaine a qualifié de violence sexuelle. Les violences sexuelles en temps de conflit vont constituer des violations du droit international des droits humains, du droit international humanitaire, du droit pénal international, du droit des réfugiés. Et moi, ici, je me concentre sur le droit international des droits humains, c'est-à-dire les règles coutumières et issues de traités qui ont, en fin de compte, imposé des devoirs aux États envers les êtres humains. On va donc avoir un chevauchement limité entre les violences sexuelles en temps de conflit armé et le droit international des droits humains. Pourquoi? Parce que je viens de le dire, le droit international des droits humains regarde la responsabilité de l'État. Or, vous n'êtes pas sans savoir qu'il existe plusieurs types de conflits armés. Le conflit armé international, qui oppose deux États. Ici, en principe, pas de problème d'imputabilité des violations de droits humains. Mais on a aussi le conflit armé non international, qui va opposer un État à des forces armées non gouvernementales ou des forces armées non gouvernementales entre elles. Donc ici, on ne peut pas imputer les violations de droits humains à un groupe armé non étatique, en principe. On a quand même le droit pénal international, mais les conditions et les causes d'engagement de la responsabilité pénale internationale ne sont pas les mêmes. Par exemple, les violences sexuelles vont être des éléments constitutifs de crimes internationaux. Le viol peut être un crime contre l'humanité, mais il faut un élément contextuel. Il faut que le viol ait eu lieu dans le cadre d'une attaque généralisée et systématique contre la population civile. De même pour les violences sexuelles comme crime de génocide. Il y a des éléments spécifiques pour qu'on constate qu'il y a un crime de génocide. Et c'est ça, là, c'est un phénomène qui est mis en avant par la critique féministe du droit, le fait que le viol va être traité différemment par le droit international en fonction qu'il ait lieu au sein du foyer, dans une prison, en temps de guerre, en temps de paix. Ceci étant dit, je vais maintenant aborder la première partie de mon intervention, qui est les violences sexuelles prises en compte par les organes de protection des droits humains comme un acte de torture ou un traitement cruel, inhumain et dégradant. L'une des affaires phares, ça va être Aydin contre Turquie de la Cour européenne des droits de l'homme, qui concerne le viol d'une jeune femme de 17 ans par l'armée turque. Et dans cette affaire, la Cour européenne des droits de l'homme a consacré l'assimilation du viol à la torture. Et on retrouve ça dans les affaires que je mentionne ici, en droit pénal international, avec la jurisprudence du Comité contre la torture, Comité de l'ONU, etc. Mais toutes les formes de violence ne vont pas être qualifiées de torture. Il y a notamment une distinction en fonction de une gradation en fonction du degré de souffrance infligée. On va parfois qualifier de mauvais traitement ou de traitement cruel, inhumain et dégradant, plutôt que d'acte de torture. En principe, tout est quand même couvert par une seule et même disposition dans les traités de droits humains. Par exemple, dans l'affaire Miguel Castro prison, que j'ai mentionnée plus tôt, les femmes forcées de rester nues sous la surveillance d'hommes armés avaient souffert d'une violation de leur droit à un traitement humain, garanti à l'article 5 de la Convention américaine, tandis qu'une femme qui, elle, dans cette même affaire, a été victime de viol, a été victime, selon la Cour, d'actes de torture, garantis au sein du même article. Il y a donc une distinction en fonction de la souffrance infligée, et on a une autre distinction que j'ai mentionnée en introduction en fonction du type de tortionnaire, en fonction de la qualité du tortionnaire. Ainsi, la Cour européenne des droits de l'homme va avoir tendance à qualifier de torture le viol commis par des agents de l'État lors d'une détention, alors qu'elle va qualifier de mauvais traitement le viol qui est commis dans la sphère privée ou dans la rue par une personne privée. Et cela a des conséquences symboliques, mais aussi en termes de réparation. On a donc cette définition classique de la torture qui reprend celle de la Convention, qui est spécialement problématique en matière de conflit armé, puisque d'un côté, on peut avoir un État responsable de torture à raison des viols, et d'un autre côté, un groupe armé non étatique responsable de mauvais traitements à cause des viols. On a tout de même un assouplissement avec notamment la jurisprudence interaméricaine dans l'affaire Lopez Soto, qui concerne l'enlèvement et la réduction en esclavage sexuel d'une jeune femme par une personne privée. Et l'État a été informé par la sœur de la victime, mais n'a pas agi. Et la Cour interaméricaine a quand même condamné l'État pour torture au titre des actes perpétrés par la personne privée, parce qu'en n'agissant pas, il avait endossé, il avait acquiescé à l'acte de torture. Par ailleurs, cette interprétation progressiste va dans le sens du droit pénal international contemporain, puisque le statut de la Cour pénale internationale n'exige pas que le tortionnaire soit un officier public, pour qu'on reconnaisse l'existence d'un acte de torture. Je précise, pour terminer cette partie, que la Cour interaméricaine prend aussi en compte l'atteinte à l'intégrité des proches de la victime, ce qui est assez intéressant en termes de prise en compte des conséquences des violences sexuelles sur les victimes et leur communauté. Oui, maintenant, partie 2, les violences sexuelles comme instrument de contrôle social. Le fait que les violences sexuelles sont une arme de guerre est très largement reconnu. Je cite ici des éléments et je n'ai pas le temps de m'y arrêter, malheureusement. Et notamment, on a la Commission africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples qui va bien reconnaître l'utilisation de la violence sexuelle comme arme de guerre, mais qui va aussi alerter dans l'affaire Céline contre RDC sur les effets pervers de se borner à voir le viol seulement comme une arme de guerre. Dans Céline contre RDC, la Commission africaine va remarquer qu'en RDC, les violences sexuelles sont devenues un fléau tellement diffus sur le territoire que ça a dépassé largement le phénomène de la guerre et qu'il faut regarder structurellement dans la discrimination sociétale. Et cela m'amène à ma partie suivante, toujours dans le contrôle social par les violences sexuelles. C'est finalement les racines discriminatoires de la violence en temps de conflit. Racines discriminatoires qui sont largement reconnues par la jurisprudence. Et je me permets notamment de citer l'affaire Azul Rojas Marin de la Cour interaméricaine qui concerne le viol d'une personne LGBTI que la Cour interaméricaine a qualifié de crime de haine en expliquant que ce crime portait atteinte non seulement aux droits de la victime, mais avait aussi envoyé un message à toutes les personnes LGBTI comme une menace pour la liberté et la dignité de ce groupe social. Il n'est cependant pas toujours évident de montrer le caractère discriminatoire de la violence sexuelle, parce que pendant longtemps, nous nous sommes bornés à la discrimination directe, c'est-à-dire au traitement différencié de personnes placées dans des situations analogues, alors que la critique féministe va souligner que l'oppression structurelle des femmes va avoir des conséquences indirectes qui doivent être prises en compte. Et là, je vous invite à y revenir en question parce que j'ai une affaire Elena Genero contre Italie qui permet d'illustrer qu'est-ce que c'est la discrimination indirecte avec beaucoup d'éloquence. Donc si ça vous intéresse d'en savoir davantage sur ce point, nous y reviendrons en question. Pour expliquer quand même un petit peu sur les violences sexuelles et la discrimination indirecte, nous avons l'affaire Eugénie Chakoupéwa du Comité des droits de l'homme qui concerne des femmes en RDC violées par des forces armées qui ont obtenu justice devant le tribunal mais qui ont ensuite jamais obtenu l'indemnisation accordée par le tribunal militaire. Et dans cette affaire, le comité a remarqué des violations, notamment de l'interdiction des discriminations. Pourtant, certaines femmes membres du comité ont fait une opinion dissidente en disant que les victimes n'avaient pas prouvé que des hommes n'auraient pas eu les mêmes difficultés à obtenir une compensation. Le Comité des droits de l'homme, lui, remarque bien que c'est en raison de l'oppression structurelle des femmes en RDC que ces femmes non seulement ont été violées, mais ensuite n'ont pas pu obtenir la justice à laquelle elles avaient droit. Pour terminer sur le viol, la violence sexuelle comme instrument de contrôle social, outre la torture et les traitements cruels et inhumains et dégradants, il est important de qualifier la violence sexuelle aussi comme une atteinte à la vie privée et familiale. C'est, somme toute, prendre en compte les conséquences de la violence sexuelle. Et on a par exemple l'affaire Phulmati Nyaya contre Népal, du Comité des droits de l'homme de l'ONU, qui concerne une jeune fille népalaise violée par l'armée alors qu'elle avait 14 ans. Et à la suite de ces viols, cette jeune fille a été stigmatisée. Elle a été en plus issue d'une communauté autochtone, donc elle a été stigmatisée, rejetée comme impure. Elle n'a pas pu aller à l'école pendant 2 ans. Une fois qu'elle a été mariée, sa famille a ensuite appris qu'elle avait été violée, donc elle a été rejetée, elle a été répudiée. Et dans cette affaire, l'État népalais a été condamné par le comité sur le fondement de l'interdiction de la torture, de l'interdiction de la discrimination et du droit à la vie privée et familiale. Bien qu'il y ait un des membres du comité qui a fait une opinion dissidente en disant qu'on étendait de trop la responsabilité de l'État en lui imputant aussi la violation de son droit à la vie privée et familiale. En guise de conclusion, j'aborde une partie 3 et je devrais être à peu près dans les temps. Donc, en cas de conflit armé, les violences sexuelles ne sont pas toujours imputables à l'État. En fait, on va avoir 2 possibilités en droit international des droits humains pour imputer des violences sexuelles à l'État. Soit on prouve que l'État avait le contrôle effectif du territoire, ce qui n'est pas toujours évident, notamment au regard de ce que j'appelle la théorie du chaos dans la jurisprudence européenne, avec l'affaire Georgie contre Russie, où la Cour européenne des droits de l'homme a dit qu'on ne pouvait pas affirmer que la Russie avait le contrôle effectif du territoire durant la phase active des hostilités, car il fallait tenir compte de la réalité même de confrontation et de combat armé dans un contexte de chaos. L'autre possibilité, c'est de montrer que l'État n'a pas respecté son obligation d'enquêter et de traduire en justice les auteurs de violences sexuelles. Cette obligation est largement ancrée en droit international des droits humains et en droit international général. Qu'est-ce que cela signifie ? Cela signifie que le viol commis dans la sphère privée ou par une personne privée est principalement appréhendé au travers de la question de la victimisation secondaire. En fait, il y a des obligations qui incombent à l'État, en termes d'enquête et de voies de recours effectives pour les victimes, ainsi qu'en termes d'exécution de la peine. Et si jamais l'État ne respecte pas ces obligations-là, il ne va pas seulement y avoir une violation du droit à un procès équitable ou du droit à un recours effectif. On va aussi avoir une violation des obligations positives procédurales qui appartiennent à l'interdiction de la torture ou au droit à la vie, par exemple. Dans l'affaire Adama Vendi de la Cour de justice de la CEDEAO, par exemple, c'est l'affaire citée tout en fin de cette slide, la Cour de justice de la CEDEAO souligne qu'en raison de la passivité des autorités qui n'ont pas enquêté ni poursuivi, elles ont facilité et promu l'impunité et que donc l'État a manqué à son devoir de protéger la requérante et était responsable de la torture, même si ce n'était pas un officier public qui l'avait perpétrée. Et en guise de véritable conclusion, nous retiendrons dans cette intervention la question de savoir si les droits humains sont adaptés à la réalité de la vie des femmes, avec une distinction de la qualification d'acte de torture en fonction du degré de souffrance, une distinction en fonction du type de tortionnaire, la question des causes de l'acte de violence sexuelle avec la prise en compte de la discrimination, la prise en compte des conséquences de l'acte avec l'atteinte à la vie privée, et enfin, la manière dont l'imputabilité de l'acte va être réalisée au travers d'obligations négatives ou positives, substantielles ou procédurales. Et je vous remercie pour votre attention.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Dumont, pour cette présentation d'une analyse très fine de la jurisprudence des principales juridictions internationales, une analyse fine des espaces normatifs de protection des droits humains dans le temps imparti. Vous avez en plus déjà tendu des perches pour que l'auditoire vous pose les questions auxquelles vous souhaitez répondre. Donc cela augure du meilleur pour la suite de ce panel qui va se poursuivre avec la présentation de Joya Elias. Je l'ai présentée tout à l'heure. Elle est programme manager à l'International Institute for Justice and the Rule of Law. She works a lot on terrorism questions, terrorism issues, the link between CRSV and terrorism. So this is the topic of your presentation this morning. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to be presenting in English, and I just want to say what a wonderful opportunity it is to share the panel with such wonderful women. Seriously, I learned so much from you today, so thank you for that. Apologize if you catch me reading, but I'm running on like 2 or 3 hours of sleep, so my wit is suffering very seriously at the moment. So I just want to start by saying I'm thrilled to be sharing this panel today to talk to you about the IIJ Sexual Violence Linked to Terrorism portfolio, which I am very grateful to be managing at the Institute. It allowed us actually to partner with a lot of familiar faces in the room today, and I would like to thank each one of them for the opportunity to brainstorm, for the resources, for the information as such. So to keep the voices of practitioners alive in what we do and in the programs we craft, we seek to always implement this mantra in our work, which is nothing about us without us is for us. And that's why I would like also to start by celebrating the work of practitioners who are constantly and tirelessly working on the investigation and prosecution of sexual violence in conflict settings, in such a remarkable way that is seriously an inspiration to all of us, and there's so much we can glean from their dedication and expertise. So as such, I encourage you to come find me in the end if you'd like to be put in touch with specific practitioners we work with, or if you'd like to get some of the resources we use in our programs. And I hope to be a faithful trustee of the knowledge they have passed on to us. So our work at the IIJ, very briefly, has started by examining the recent typologies and emerging dynamics of gendered violence and the fractionalization of conflict in the African continent specifically. The discussions touched upon several things, including the concept of sexual violence linked to terrorism, which I will be explaining in a bit, the investigative and prosecutorial challenges, and legal pluralism impact on the access for justice for victims. A common finding of our work, which started this entire inception about the idea, was that in the many countries we work with, legal frameworks are often inexistent, incomplete, or otherwise good laws existed that have been repealed with time. I can give the example of the Burkina Faso law, number 061/2015, that puts a specific cadre, a specific system, in terms of specific judicial procedures for victims of sexual violence. And this law was later repealed, and as such, at the moment, there is legislative absence of specific procedures for the care of victims of sexual violence. However, what we were able to later deduce from our work is, it is not because, but despite of the limitations of laws prosecuting sexual violence, that progressive interpretations of the nexus between conflict-related sexual violence, terrorism, and other forms of criminality can actually be put in place and can be used to counter and compensate on these legislative limitations. I'm sharing the panel today with people who have worked on this, and specifically on the issue of TIP, for example, but I will be talking about other forms of criminality as I go forward in my intervention. So the key issue we found in cases of terrorism discussed is that charges of sexual violence in terrorism cases are secondary charges. No one actually wants to talk about them, and even if they want to talk about them, often there's not enough evidence and priority is not put on those charges specifically. My colleague Hope will talk in the next panel about the evidentiary challenges in those cases. It is why ensuring accountability for the underlying conduct behind sexual violence is necessary to be made using whatever legislation is available in X country, so that prosecuting sexual violence as terrorism can actually ensure a recognition of the gravity of this offense in a terrorist context. Distinct from political and other general definitions of what sexual terrorism is, sexual terrorism at the core is a form and manifestation of the crime of terrorism. And terrorism is a very specific crime with a very specific intent. I actually explain it to myself and to whoever I get the chance to speak to with an analogy that was given to me when I was working with the Yazidi victims of terrorism in Iraq. And one of our lead psychologists told me, Joya, victims of sexual terrorism are very different from victims of sexual violence in peacetime settings. Because those victims, even the programs that are built for them from a psychological point of view, is built to accompany them in their understanding of this immense injustice and incomprehension that they suffered from having had to deal with a punishment on a specific religion, on a specific ethnicity, on a specific group that they are carrying in their own bodies. And I'm just using this as an analogy to say that there is difference in highlighting the same crime in different contexts. And I think this is the sole purpose of why we decide to approach sexual violence from a terrorism perspective. And since there is no single definition of what international terrorism is, there are some common features to the definition, such as acts of violence intended to intimidate a population or compel a government or an international organization to do or abstain from doing any act. General definition. But sexual terrorism can be understood in two different ways: a narrow perspective and more of a broader perspective. From a narrow perspective, it is the act that is committed with the specific intent to utilize sexual violence as a weapon of a terrorist group, so to achieve a terrorist aim. The mens rea, the intent here, is the central piece to this definition. And as such, the intent to terrorize using sexual violence can be extracted from a simple pattern and effect observation by the effect of sexual violence that it has on a specific group, on a specific community, etc. This is a narrow definition of it, but there is also a broader definition, which talks specifically about understanding sexual violence in different dimensions where actually terrorist groups benefit from the use of sexual violence through direct and indirect ways for other types of criminality. So I can give an example of financing their activities, trafficking people, just like Dr. Farida Brouwer was mentioning, targeting a specific political ethnic group, or using sexual violence to recruit new members, to radicalize members already existing. There's a lot of work currently being done on understanding the effect of sexual violence perpetrated by members, especially young members of a terrorist group, and how does that help build cohesion of one terrorist group between each other. So there are different dimensions to understand sexual violence and the way groups use it to benefit from it. And as such, this broad approach is what we try to elucidate in our work. And we noticed that in the many countries we have worked with the exception of Burkina Faso, I can also add to the list of Kosovo, Tunisia, and Colombia, who have an express mention of sexual violence in their city legislation. Often city legislations do not reference sexual violence. And in the absence of laws that appropriately contextualize it, we have some challenges that rise up. I can mention two. Two of the main challenges why sexual violence addressed as a terrorism offense is problematic. One, the evidentiary requirements that may be difficult to meet in the context of terrorism, especially for mass attacks, mass atrocities, and my colleague Hope will talk about that in length. But second, the modes of liability and responsibility currently present do not help with this, because as long as we look at it in these settings as a direct victim-perpetrator link, which works relatively well in peacetime conflict-related sexual violence settings, it does not work well in places where there is unknown perpetrators, a huge number of perpetrators, no medical corroboration done on time, long passage of time, and remote locations where the crime was committed come into play altogether. It is why this mode of liability needs to be rethought, and it's why places like this is a good idea to start brainstorming for this. By mainstreaming sexual violence in terrorism case investigations and prosecutions, we begin to think differently about how we charge this crime. Here are some ways I can list. If a city legislation includes a provision that stipulates that an act that violates the provision of international treaties or resolutions to which each state abides to or is a party to qualifies as a terrorist act, then this is a way in which sexual violence linked to terrorism can be charged. And there are a lot of actual domesticated treaties in the African continent, because that's why I'm referring to because of our work there, that can be used. For example, the African Charter on Human Rights, Article 5, 7, 12, right to integrity, dignity, human freedom of movement, liberty, the Geneva Conventions and Common Article 3, all of these can be brought into play under this approach for sexual violence linked to terrorism. Second, if we consider all forms of evidence and new forms of evidence, including digital, forensic, physical, but also if we approach it from a different perspective. For example, I can list 2 examples recently of women in an whole camp who were impregnating young men to generate a new generation of caliphate. And they, at the place where this was actually unrevealed, they saw a huge amount of sex enhancement drugs that were taken, and those were used as a proof, as evidentiary proof of sexual violence being committed against these youth. So this is one way to also reconsider what set of evidence we ought to bring to these cases. And finally, connect the dots between sexual terrorism and other forms of criminality, including financing of terrorism and whatnot. And here, I would like to go back to your presentation when you spoke about also linking it from a feminist approach, and what are these offenses that give it a very whole different meaning. One of our incredible colleagues from Uganda said, if terrorism, and I'm quoting it, she said, if terrorism is a harm to a state, it is a harm to a state because it is considered to touch upon the masculinity of men. How do we address it? One way to address it is to make the issue of sexual violence more attractive to prosecute, and by linking it to subjects of interest to the male population overseeing terrorism cases, such as the financing of terrorism. And that's a very interesting way to actually approach this institutionally. So now I will move to a list of causes of why, 5 more minutes? Okay, then no causes. Then I will just move to a list of how our colleagues, because I would like to put a focus on them, how they managed to emphasize in their endeavors in prosecuting sexual violence linked to terrorism in their work. In some cases communicated to us, trauma was used as an evidence of the perpetration. An unwanted pregnancy is sometimes considered proof of rape, because as a result, also proof of forced penetration. Intel, as important as it is in CT cases, cannot always be admitted as evidence. And hearsay, in the same way, cannot always be admitted as evidence in sexual violence cases. But when it is corroborated with other circumstantial evidence, it is necessary and it is accepted. We heard from some of our colleagues in Nigeria, for example, that working on cases for the prosecution of sexual violence, the current legal practice is growing more and more into equating any form of grave sexual violence with that of the crime of rape if the elements are not elucidated for maximum sentencing. There is a wave of increased investigation of the interlinkage of sexual violence with other types of crime, especially when we're talking about torture, abduction, enslavement, and that is on the rise. There is an increased practice about the consensus that when the credibility of a victim is in question, it doesn't change their status as a victim and should be dealt with accordingly. These are incredible information we got on how things are currently working in these systems. As a result of the discussions, very briefly, I have a set of recommendations from our counterparts, both in substance and in form, but I will stick to the substance for the moment present. There is need to address a range of issues related to sexual violence in the context of terrorism, including the difficulties of defining it and elucidating its manifestation in the context of terrorist activities in different geographical zones. There are also the challenges related to the limited application of the intersectionality between sexual violence and other types of crime. There are the issues of jurisdiction, specialized courts, specialized judges, and often no MLA agreements present that help cross-regional, cross-national prosecutions. There is a need to further research on, for the researchers present with us today, endogenous and exogenous causes of sexual violence in the African continent, And with the new waves that we are currently witnessing, especially in DRC, just like Madam Special Representative mentioned, in DRC, in CAR, in Mozambique, there is need to be the centerpiece of our focus before it becomes too late. There is a need to create witness and victim protection structures within the courts and, when possible, outside the courts, in coordination with victim supports group in the country. Former structures need to include safe houses, relocation programs, both on a local and regional level, and that also includes witness protection programs. There is a need to adopt legal reforms to allow for cumulative charging and develop training programs to effectively implement cumulative charging for offenses related to sexual violence linked to terrorism and other grave offenses. And on a regional level, there are a set of issues, but we know them, jurisdictional issues, political tensions, but also there are different legal standards that sometimes make it difficult to share evidence and extradite suspects from one country to another. So I have another set of recommendations, but that's more for international organizations, but I don't know if I have the time to say it.
Yes,
I
you
have
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay, I run it through
Because
very
you are
quickly.
Gioia Elias.
Yeah. So very quickly, this set of recommendations is for actually the organizations much like the one I'm representing right now, who work with our partners on the ground for technical assistance programs. We have some problems, and those need to be addressed in an institutional manner as well. First, there's a lack of coordination and duplication of initiatives addressing sexual violence in conflict. And this is leading to a major sense of confusion with national authorities, especially when it comes to defining appropriate legal frameworks to use when working on an investigation and prosecution of sexual violence. There are cultural differences between the expectations of international organizations and the traditional beliefs and capabilities of partner countries, which sometimes hinder the effect of our strategies and our programs. There are limited resources that make it difficult to implement the outcomes of activities, and I can mention the DPP's office in Uganda at the moment is running at 38% of its capacity. So that makes it incredibly hard to actually engage or collaborate or even support in what they need, because the type of support they need is very different from sometimes what we offer. There is a language barrier that makes it difficult to communicate effectively and can limit the initiatives that we craft. Lack of local ownership in programs designed and implemented is also a major issue. And by fostering more participation from our colleagues in the region, in the programs we design, in the implementation, and in the opportunities offered for them, we create a sense of ownership and commitment to these initiatives that make them impactful. There's a lack of proper monitoring and evaluation. And finally, there is some distrust regarding that stem actually from historical factors. But all of these need to be addressed so that we can approach the issue of programs on sexual violence, investigation and prosecution in a more sufficient manner, a more efficient way, but also in a way that makes us remember that we are as good as the ability to create a lasting impact. And that has to be implemented at the core of all our programs. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, dear Mrs. Elias, dear Gioia, for this very rich presentation on a fascinating topic. This is a very important one. I could not refuse you the opportunity to share your views and recommendation for international organization in this context, and that was really constructive. Thank you very much for also these recommendations, practical recommendations. Nous allons maintenant entrer dans la deuxième phase de ce panel qui va permettre les échanges. Et je voudrais, dans un premier temps, donner la priorité, peut-être, aux échanges entre les intervenantes qui composent ce panel. Est-ce que vous voudriez réagir, l'une ou l'autre des intervenantes, à ce qui a pu être dit en lien avec votre propre sujet? Après quoi, nous ouvrirons la discussion avec l'Assemblée des auditeurs. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Yes, I had a comment related to the presentation of Lorraine. Thank you so much. This review of the legislation under the legal feminist theory, it's something that resonates with what we are also doing at the ICRC. IHL was also written by men, mainly. The Geneva Conventions, at least at the time. And we noticed then some IHR rules have a man in mind and not a woman. For example, the warning. So before an attack, parties to the conflict shall give warning to the civilian population that might be affected by the attack. Concretely, this warning is often done by throwing leaflets from planes. But in some countries, the people in the street are men and not women, and women stay at home. So women, in fact, rely on men to have a warning. Another aspect always related to the warning before an attack. So between the warning and the attack itself, the party shall give to the civilians sufficient time to evacuate. But this time is calculated on men's needs, while women often have to take the children with them and carry them outside to a safer location. So the time is calculated as if you just receive a warning and you run outside. But for women who have the responsibility of caring for the family, this time should actually be longer. So we are really carrying out this reflection and taking all provisions and the way they are applied and assess them through these different eyes. So thank you for sharing your reflections as well.
Merci Paola. C'est très important d'avoir ces exemples concrets pour montrer comment le droit, qui est censé être toujours objectif, est en fait fondé sur un biais structurel. Et c'est là l'essence de la critique féministe du droit. Et on en revient à ce que disait Madame la secrétaire générale adjointe, le fait de partir des victimes, c'est aussi le fait de construire le droit en fonction des besoins plutôt que d'un point de vue extérieur. Et ça, c'est un élément fondamental de la critique féministe du droit qui s'appelle la théorie du positionnement. La théorie du positionnement, c'est que la personne qui construit le droit, même en voulant être la plus objective possible, va forcément modeler le droit sur son expérience. Il n'y a pas de réelle objectivité scientifique, et encore moins en sciences sociales. J'en profite aussi peut-être pour poser une question à Anne-Marie. Sur la différence entre... elle est peut-être très naïve, et j'en suis désolée. La différence entre slave trade et human trafficking.
There's a lot of... Oh, sorry. I hear myself double. So, yeah, they are quite similar, but I think the slave trade has its origin in international law, in the 1926 Convention on Slavery and the subsequent protocols. So it has that ancient history, while human trafficking also has an ancient history, but is mostly defined in the Palermo Protocol. But they both have the intention to reduce a person to exploitation. So it's actually the phase, indeed, before the slavery occurs. And enslavement and sexual slavery is the actual taking of the power of ownership over that person. So both the slave trade and human trafficking are the phases before, but they originated in different regimes and have different frameworks and different elements. A little bit. So can I also take this opportunity to to ask a few questions? Because I was just wondering, listening to you all, like, for instance, I sometimes still get that impression that we are working in silos. So, like, for instance, the thing you said about the torture, that the European Court really was looking at it from the perspective, like, of rape as a form of torture, rather than also recognizing it sometimes as rape or other forms of sexual violence. Even though we know, I mean, the ICTY did that also at the beginning phase, but later on they changed this. And even though you can still, of course, prosecute rape as torture, but, you know, are we learning from each other in that perspective? Human rights law together with international criminal law. Of course, it are different regimes. But then I was also listening, I think, to Joya, what you were saying, like with the modes of liability in terms of mass atrocities for terrorism, that it's so difficult, even though we have a lot of learnings also at the tribunals on how actually make that easier. So for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. So can we not take more of these kind of examples from other jurisdictions, other frameworks, to be implemented also in this case, terrorism, for instance? So is there not much more to learn from each other while looking at it in silos, rather? Yes.
I mean, the only possible reaction to this is yes, we definitely have so much to learn about from each other. And also the problem is that, yes, we work in silos and on specific programs, in specific geographic regions, on specific topics. But specifically with the question on modes of liability, there is so much that has already been done from jurisprudence, whether it's international, regional, local, and that can be implemented for cases of sexual violence linked to terrorism specifically, where we expand also modes of liability and responsibility and understanding who's aiding in the commission of a crime, who is helping directly or indirectly. And a good question, a good follow-up question to that, I think, would be, how do we connect all these separate efforts in one joint effort, global effort, so that we can be working on something way more impactful than individually? That would be my question to the panel, to the group. It's good to brainstorm together on this.
Merci beaucoup à nouveau aux quatre intervenants de ce matin pour des exposés brillants, des exposés qui portent sur des sujets très très intéressants. Les premiers échanges l'ont été aussi, mais je voudrais maintenant donner la possibilité aux autres personnes réunies dans cette salle d'interagir avec les membres de cette table ronde. Y a-t-il, mesdames et messieurs, des questions? Et la priorité ira à Madame la secrétaire générale adjointe.
Thank you very much to all the panelists for your brilliant presentation. It's really encouraging because I see future partners. I mean, like, we are already partnering with Anne-Marie, but I see potential partnership with many of you. I have a question for you. I mean, like, it's very frustrating from my standpoint in terms of the very interesting presentation that you made about prosecution, but even investigation, question for Joya about maybe your work in Iraq, because I recall when I was in Iraq working with the chief of the Judicial Council on prosecution of sexual violence as act of terrorism. I mean, like, it was very frustrating because he started by like treating me like not understanding the law and saying, oh, you know, SRSG, it's like much easier for me to go under the anti-terrorism law and to prosecute for affiliation only. And this is an open and shut case. So we just prosecute members of Daesh. And like I reminded him that failure to prosecute the sexual violence, including the interpretation of their anti-terrorism law, but also their interpretation of their trafficking laws, how these laws could be used cumulatively, as you mentioned, to prosecute cases, and because otherwise there will be no historical record of the sexual violence that took place. It was extremely frustrating because I was engaging with the survivors of sexual violence who wanted justice, and I even met with survivors who were relocated in Germany who were so keen to have their day in court, and the office wanted to provide some support, which did not materialize because of the death penalty also, which was another obstacle that we faced at the UN. That's why I'm encouraged by the case against Boko Haram, for example, in Nigeria. But I really want to hear in terms of concretely your work in Iraq, because I know that justice takes time, and I never lose hope.
Actually, we need more people like you who keep holding on to hope. But frustration is a very big word I felt working with Yazidi victims who I can say humbly that have morphed into friends, not just partners at a certain point. And their stories kept me awake for nights and nights on end, hearing them and having to interact. Criminal justice officials in Iraq always replied with participation, affiliation, and any sort of engagement in terrorist activity, and that's all we need to prosecute terrorism charges, terrorist activity specifically. But sexual violence very much overlooked, and that's why in the work that we were trying to do back with UNODC, because I was the UNODC, is trying to understand and redefine what is a victim of terrorism in the Iraqi legislation. How can we ensure access to justice for victims? How can we ensure protection measures in the criminal proceedings, but also after the end of criminal proceedings? How can we protect witnesses in the structure currently present? What is the relationship between courts and other organizations or other civil society organizations that come into play in this protection? What is the relationship of the court with the media, especially with the heightened media on the Yazidi victims? But also, for example, what is the effect of the unwanted kids of the Yazidi girls, which was a big issue. And often all of them, when you ask them what happened to them, they would completely not mention that they have kids that they had to leave behind, because in their community and by the Iraqi law, if they come back to Iraq with a kid, they will automatically have to be listed if an unknown dad is, in that case, as Muslim kids, and as such, they would be repealed from their own community. So that was a big issue. And also something I wanted to mention specifically on the Directorate General for Yazidi Affairs. It shows to the extent to which sometimes certain governments do not put so much focus on the issue of sexual violence in the little things that are done, which in this case is not so little, because they failed to put a budgetary cut in the national budget for at least a year and a half when the Directorate for Yazidi Affairs was created. And as such, they had a completely functional directorate, but there was no money to fund personnel, programs, etc. And it goes to the extent to which sometimes sexual violence is put on the secondary plan. Still very frustrating to me, but I also look at it with so much hope.
D'autres questions? Professeur Admillet-Deval.
Oui, merci. J'ai une question à l'ensemble des panélistes, peut-être, puisque il a été question ce matin d'instruments universels, d'instruments régionaux également, et de jurisprudence régionale. Pour avoir une idée peut-être en matière d'efficience ou d'efficacité du niveau d'action le plus propice à lutter contre les violences sexuelles liées au conflit. Est-ce que vous pensez que l'action au niveau régional n'est pas peut-être la plus précise, la plus efficace, et notamment pour ce qui concerne l'Europe, le continent européen? J'avais aussi des interrogations sur une éventuelle valeur ajoutée qui pouvait être apportée par la Convention d'Istanbul. Voilà.
Merci beaucoup pour votre question. J'en profite pour repréciser que le droit international des droits humains, en principe, pour aller devant une cour de droits humains, il faut toujours avoir épuisé les voies de recours internes. Donc, c'est une approche qui est toujours complémentaire de la voie nationale, en principe, sauf si on peut démontrer que les voies de recours internes ne sont pas effectives, ce qui peut être plus facile, entre guillemets, à démontrer dans le cas de violences graves et massives des droits humains. Mais donc, en principe, je biaise un petit peu, mais sur la question de l'efficience ou de l'efficacité, c'est l'approche complémentaire qui est la meilleure. Et c'est parce qu'il y a cette obligation d'épuiser les voies de recours internes que les cours de droits humains vont aussi beaucoup s'axer sur la question de la victimisation secondaire et est-ce que l'État a correctement répondu aux besoins de la victime en termes d'accès à la justice. Une exception, c'est la Cour de justice de la CEDEAO, la Communauté économique d'Afrique de l'Ouest, qui, elle, n'exige pas d'épuisement des voies de recours pour qu'elle soit saisie. Et sur l'Europe, donc la Cour européenne des droits de l'homme, c'est celle qui déclare le plus de recours irrecevables. Donc elle va très peu juger sur le fond. Elle connaît aussi un contentieux massif par rapport aux autres cours de droits humains. Elle n'a pas les moyens de recevoir toutes les requêtes et la plupart des plaintes déposées devant la Cour européenne des droits de l'homme sont irrecevables en général. Donc il faut quand même réussir à outrepasser le filtre de la recevabilité de la Cour européenne des droits de l'homme. C'est une première épreuve, notamment en termes de violation des droits des femmes qui ne sont pas toujours correctement prises en compte. Un exemple, affaire Irene Wilson de la Cour européenne des droits de l'homme, 2012, une femme victime de violences domestiques. La Cour européenne des droits de l'homme a dit que l'affaire n'était pas recevable car les violences n'étaient pas assez graves, car elle avait été frappée une seule fois. Donc là, on a un exemple de comment les droits humains vont être inadaptés aux droits des femmes. Alors c'est une affaire dramatique et c'est une affaire assez isolée, mais elle existe. Donc sur la Convention d'Istanbul, il existe un organisme, le Grevio, qui va être chargé de faire des rapports, etc. C'est un organisme, c'est intéressant, le mécanisme des rapports pour que les États progressent, notamment au niveau de leur législation, c'est intéressant, mais il n'y a pas de juridiction capable de connaître de violations de la Convention d'Istanbul. La Cour européenne des droits de l'homme l'utilise pour interpréter, mais ne peut pas constater de violation de cette convention. Pardon, j'ai pris un petit peu de temps pour ma réponse.
No, I was just thinking about it more from an educational perspective. Like, if you think about everything that we have achieved on the international level with the tribunals and the courts, etc., then the regional level, the courts that you also have been discussing, and the national level, and actually to try to put everything together. Because I think what you also mentioned already, you mentioned it in the beginning, like many people are working in this field and things are coming together now. Also with the checklist, I think that you're developing, the Mukwege Foundation, you have the Red Line Initiative with all the conventions where you can find a lot of information. The PSVI is doing a lot at UN level. So there is so much information, but it's not always already assembled together. So I think that would be really helpful because then we can also even learn more from each other. What is there in the field of human rights law or international criminal law or terrorism law? So we get educated even more so. So maybe, yeah, and I think that's actually what you are trying to do also with your initiative. So to some extent, but that would be really helpful, I think.
D'autres questions? Professeur Emmanuel Saunier-Cassia.
Je voulais juste prolonger la question de ma collègue Anne, ça n'étonnera personne, les deux européanistes du groupe, pour insister tout de même, au regard de ce qui a été dit par toutes et tous, la nécessaire coopération, travail commun, pluridisciplinarité dans les approches, c'est ce que fait la Convention d'Istanbul. Cette approche pluridisciplinaire, extrêmement large dans la définition de ce qu'est une violence sexuelle aussi, et qui doit inspirer, je pense, les autres instruments internationaux de protection. Et par ailleurs, j'aimerais aussi insister sur le fait que la Convention d'Istanbul vient d'être ratifiée par l'Union européenne. Enfin, elle est désormais en vigueur s'agissant de l'Union européenne depuis le 1er octobre 2023, ce qui peut avoir des conséquences juridiques, ou ce que l'on peut souhaiter en tout cas, notamment dans une autre perspective qui est celle de l'adhésion, qui est une question qui revient enfin, j'allais dire, sur le bureau des choses importantes, de l'adhésion de l'Union européenne à la CEDH. Et cette conjonction d'événements et d'adhésion pourrait être propice à une utilisation complémentaire aux autres instruments de protection en s'agissant des violences sexuelles qui me semble encourageante en tout cas. Voilà, c'était juste.
Merci. Professeur Bérengère Taxil, qui veut réagir également.
Juste un complément pour prolonger 30 secondes, une remarque sur une décision historique de la Cour de justice de l'Union européenne qui a été rendue il y a quelques jours en matière de droit d'asile, mais qui va bien au-delà, parce que justement c'est le prisme de la Convention d'Istanbul et du fait que l'Union européenne y est désormais partie, qui a mené à ce que la Cour consacre le groupe social des femmes comme potentiel exposé à des persécutions et éligible à une protection internationale parce qu'elles sont femmes. Et de ce fait, la Cour de justice mène à interpréter le droit d'asile à la lumière de la Convention d'Istanbul et à appliquer l'effet de la Convention d'Istanbul à la Bulgarie qui n'est pas partie à la Convention. Donc il y a quelque chose ici de très intéressant dans les interactions entre les différents champs du droit et sur cette perspective de considérer les femmes, discutables, mais sur les effets de la Convention d'Istanbul, on en reparlera, j'en suis sûre. Merci.
Merci. Professeur Muriel Hubeda-Sayar.
Oui, je voudrais juste rebondir sur les propos de Bérangère Textil, du coup, évidemment, parce que je me demande s'il n'y aurait pas ici un biais pour pouvoir aborder quand même la question dramatique de l'Afghanistan et la question d'un éventuel apartheid de genre qui peut montrer quand même... Alors, voilà. La question de la lutte contre les violences sexuelles, lorsque celles-ci sont érigées comme modèle de gouvernement, ça peut être quand même une limite au rapport de système et à l'influence du droit international ou des droits régionaux sur l'organisation et l'autonomie constitutionnelle de certains États. Donc voilà, j'aurais aimé déjà parler de l'Afghanistan, parce que quand même, voilà, il faut en parler. Et puis, peut-être demander le sentiment des panélistes sur la question, que ce soit les femmes comme groupe social, évoqué par Bérangère, ou la question d'une criminalisation d'un apartheid de genre.
Petite note, si je peux me permettre, sur l'Afghanistan, il y a au moins 3 pays européens, inclus la Suisse, qui donne automatiquement le droit d'asile aux femmes afghanes en raison du fait qu'ils sont des femmes d'Afghanistan. Juste... Voilà.
Merci beaucoup pour ces réactions en cascade, ces précisions. Le micro circule de manière complètement autonome.
Moi, je rajoute.
Parfait, ouais. Parfait. Je me soumets absolument, allez-y.
Non, mais la Cour nationale de droit d'asile en France l'a fait aussi. Exactement, ça. Donc, oui, mais quand même, on avance un petit peu. Moi, j'essaye d'être positive.
Bien. Merci. On peut prendre encore une dizaine de minutes pour alimenter cet échange. Je vois une demande également. Je vous en prie, et après, on réagit.
Je suis Madame Jocelyne Milandou-Kanza du Congo-Brazzaville. Je voulais féliciter, bien entendu, le panel composé de ces brillantes expertes, mais je suis restée un petit peu sur ma faim parce qu'on n'a pas abordé les questions du génocide au Rwanda, parce que je voulais quand même dire qu'il y a eu une avancée significative, parce que les faits qui se sont produits au Rwanda et également en ex-Yougoslavie ont été tellement médiatisés, et c'est l'occasion justement de saluer le travail des journalistes, que finalement, dans la répression de ces violences sexuelles, on est arrivé à ériger le viol en acte constitutif de crime contre l'humanité. Je tenais quand même à ce que cela soit souligné, s'agissant de ce qui s'est passé en Afrique, notamment au Rwanda et également en ex-Yougoslavie. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Je propose que les intervenantes répondent. Alors, sur la proposition du cas afghan, sur la proposition du cas rwandais. Who wants to start answering? Yes, please.
I can react to this last comment. Absolutely, and indeed the case law of the ICTR and the ICTY has been absolutely key in developing the crime, the war crime of sexual violence. So I think we owe a lot to that case law. And it is greatly because of them that we have a much broader definition of sexual violence as a war crime and a crime against humanity nowadays that is now in customary law but also in the statute of the International Criminal Court. So definitely an acknowledgement for that contribution. Thank you.
Yes, thank you on that point. I think indeed, as you mentioned, it's one of the most one of the very important acknowledgements in 1998 with the Akayesu judgment. I think there is a phase before Akayesu and after. So Akayesu was so important to recognize sexual violence as genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda in 1994. Only 5 cases afterwards also had sexual violence as genocide before the Rwanda tribunal, which I think is a little bit sad if you see how much genocidal sexual violence took place there. But fortunately, we have this precedent now, and it's being prosecuted and being thought of also in places like Myanmar. So it has been really so important. And I think also when you look at Rwanda and the national cases they had before the Gacaca, 7,000 cases of sexual violence were prosecuted there. So Rwanda was in that sense a country where the no impunity rule for international crimes really took place, right? 7,000 cases of sexual violence were prosecuted there as genocide. So yes, I think very important case that we should not, or recognition we should underline. Thank you.
Je mentionnais ce matin que nous avions reçu presque que des réponses favorables des personnes que nous avons invitées. La seule personne qui n'a pas pu nous rejoindre, mais parce qu'elle est engagée dans des cours aux États-Unis à l'heure actuelle, est Fausto Pokar, le président du Tribunal international pour l'ex-Yougoslavie, qui a ensuite présidé l'Institut international de droit humanitaire. Nous l'avions précisément invité pour qu'il donne l'éclairage du rôle qu'il a joué considérable dans l'évolution de la jurisprudence du Tribunal pénal international pour l'ex-Yougoslavie. Je voulais mentionner son nom ce matin. Nous regrettons qu'il n'ait pas pu venir. Joya Elias, je vous en prie, continue.
No, just a very brief intervention saying that international jurisprudence is constantly developing, and that's a very positive sign of something not going into coma. But also, as you can just mention, the Dominic Ongwen case of 2022 and the charge of forced pregnancy that was for the first time in a precedent actually put forward in that case. And it was mentioned that it touches upon reproductive integrity and it's a form of reproductive violence. And as such, we are constantly moving towards new interpretations, new ways we look at crimes, and also how we can charge them, how we can bring evidence to charge them. And that is an inspiration for regional courts, but also national ones to implement. So just wanted to make that remark.
Nous pouvons prendre encore 3 minutes, puis ensuite interrompre les travaux pour rejoindre le déjeuner. Y aurait-il une dernière question? Je vous en prie. N'hésitez pas à vous présenter directement.
Kanigula Mubagwa, professeur émérite. Je viens du Congo et je ne vais pas poser de questions, mais faire quelques commentaires, puisque finalement le Congo, c'est l'autre Congo, le Grand Congo, qui a une mauvaise réputation d'avoir été la capitale du viol du monde, à cause du fait qu'il y a, pendant plusieurs décennies, des violences qui se sont commises, notamment les violences sexuelles. Alors, la bonne nouvelle, c'est que récemment, l'État a essayé de prendre ses responsabilités. C'est ça que je voudrais un peu communiquer, avec la création d'un fonds pour la réparation des victimes, des violences sexuelles liées au conflit, mais aussi des victimes liées à d'autres crimes contre la paix et la sécurité de l'humanité. Ça, c'est donc un pas positif que je veux inscrire dans ce que Mme Pramila Patten a encore mentionné ce matin, qui avait quand même quelques points souvent positifs. Évidemment, le problème ici, c'est que il s'agit seulement de violences sexuelles liées au conflit. Comme on l'a rappelé ici, quelqu'un l'a mentionné, les violences au Congo, au début, étaient liées aux guerres. Avec le temps, la pratique des violences sexuelles s'est déplacée et elle est maintenant pratiquée presque par tout le monde, par les civils principalement. Et ça, c'est effectivement une question qui reste. Donc, bien que nous ayons ce centre, ce fonds qui a été créé, il ne se limite qu'à un aspect des violences sexuelles. Il faut donc qu'on ne perde pas l'attention des autres violences sexuelles qui ne sont pas liées au conflit. Donc ça, je le dis puisque nous sommes ici en tant que FONAREV à la recherche de collaboration avec des gens comme vous. Alors la question que je voulais poser, c'est celle-ci. Il a été fait mention de l'urgence d'adresser les problèmes de violences sexuelles en RDC, au Mozambique. Je crois qu'il y avait un autre troisième pays. Je voulais savoir sur quels critères on se basait. Je suis d'accord avec cette conclusion, mais j'aimerais savoir, je crois que c'était Madame Elias qui avait mentionné ça, sur quelles raisons elle s'était fondée pour dire que c'était vraiment une urgence qu'il fallait traiter, sinon le problème allait devenir irréversible. Je crois que c'est ça que vous aviez dit.
Merci, chers collègues. Donc oui, nous profitons pour signaler la présence dans ce colloque d'une délégation du FONAREV, de République démocratique du Congo. Soyez les bienvenus. 3 personnes du FONAREV qui ont fait le déplacement jusqu'à Nice. Et nous allons bénéficier de votre éclairage également. Alors, je pense qu'il sera particulièrement pertinent et précieux dans le cadre du 3e panel sur les mécanismes de réparation. Mais Joya, je vous invite à répondre.
En fait, actually, I will speak in English if that's okay, simply because some things are stuck in my mind in English with regards to that. There is a growing trend, I think, right now at the moment also to discuss misogyny and sexual violence committed and the link between them, especially in conflict settings. Domestic violence is another form of that, and I had the pleasure of working with the Minister of Justice and Family, Gender and Family in Burkina Faso on programs where actually they look at that. They look at the effect of sexual violence in peacetime settings, but also how they get accentuated in cases of terrorism and in mass atrocities and in the war in humanitarian provinces across Burkina Faso. And it was very genuine, and I'd like to share that with you, how they were able to create structures in each province that actually helps and provides the community with the answer coming from the community. And they created something called l'École de Marie in different humanitarian provinces, where they were able to talk about all issues related to sexual violence, whether that was specifically in peacetime settings or in conflict or terrorism settings. And soon, the men in the community started bringing their friends and their brothers and it all grew into this very good campaign that the Ministry of Gender and Family put forward in those provinces. And it helped so much in also bringing forward a lot of cases, new cases, for the investigation and prosecution of sexual violence. So actually, I'm not sure what was the remark you mentioned that I said. If you can, I would love to answer it, if you can just remind me. But that is on the subject of sexual violence taken outside of the context of only terrorism or war.
Maybe I misunderstood you, but I thought that you had mentioned 3 countries in which addressing sexual problems related to sexual violence was necessary and urgent. Otherwise, the situation would become uncontrollable.
Very quickly, sorry. I actually wanted to say, what I meant was those countries actually have provisions on sexual violence in their terrorism legislation. And one of those countries, as Dr. Mali mentioned, the 3 of them are Tunisia, Kosovo, Colombia, but also Burkina Faso, who we have recently learned that they have it in their CT legislation, but it hasn't been put in motion yet in any case. It hasn't been interpreted and actually applied. But this is the focus. This was the focus of the countries.
Okay, I think it's time to end this very first panel, and on behalf of the entire audience, I would like to thank once again warmly the 4 panelists for their brilliant presentation and sharing their views on the topics. Thank you so much. We have started the colloquium under the best auspices, thanks to you. Thank you once again.
Thank you.